I had two different types of people in mind when I thought about making this video on how to use plugins in Presonus Studio One. The first person, maybe you got Presonus Studio One with an audio interface this past Christmas. You're jumping into digital audio workstations and you're just not sure where to start. Well, today's video is for you. The second type of person I was thinking of with this video is someone who has been using Studio One, or you've been using DAWs for a while. You've been loading plugins, maybe an EQ or a compressor here or there, but you don't really have like a framework of what you're doing. You've just seen stuff online of other people using plugins, and you just want to have a more focused approach of using plugins in something like Presonus Studio One. Well, this video is also for you, so I want to encourage you to watch all the way to the end. You might pick up some tidbits of things that are going to set you on the right path for success, so you can have more fun when you're recording music, specifically at home. My name is Chris Green. My whole channel is practical tips for playing and recording music at home. If this is interesting to you, I want to encourage you to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more videos just like this. If you haven't jumped into Presonus Studio One ever, I would encourage you to watch a few other videos on my channel. I've got a couple of them where I record a song from beginning to end. One of those specifically goes into mixing, so you can watch that and then come back to this video at a later time. If you're watching this video, take it in chunks. I'll try to put chapters in the bottom of the timeline so that you can navigate where to go from here. So let's jump in. I've got a session in Presonus Studio One, and let's talk plugins. Your song might have a bunch of vocals. Your songs might have brass and synthesizers. It's going to really be specific to the song that you're using. But what I want to talk about today are the philosophies of why you use plugins and why you might want to start using plugins when you're mixing. There are a couple of things I want you to keep in mind when you go to add plugins to your mix. That is going to the dentist. I want you to think about when you last went to the dentist. What did the dentist do? Did they start putting whitening strips, or did they start whitening your teeth as soon as you sat down in the chair? Probably the first thing that they did, if you haven't been in a while, they probably took x-rays of your teeth to find out what's going on in your mouth. Then what they would do is they take all their tools and they start scraping off all the plaque and they try to clean your teeth. Then at the end, they try to polish it up and they try to whiten your teeth. What does that have to do with mixing audio? I want you to keep two things in mind when you're mixing, when you're going to add plugins. I want you to ask yourself, am I cleaning or am I coloring? Okay, so a good mindset to have when you go in and you sit down at a mix, or you just recorded something on the computer, is I want you to ask yourself, how can I clean this up? Cleaning involves things like, is this too loud? Does it need to be quieter? Is there a hissing sound? Is there something that's distracting me from the instrument? If I've got a bass guitar and I hear this sizzling, like humming sound, maybe there was a grounding issue on the recording, that would be something that's involved cleaning. So I need to use plugins that are going to help me clean up the track. Now, second part, other than cleaning, is coloring. Ask yourself, do I need to color this track? By coloring, I mean giving it a vibe, making something happen that didn't happen during the recording. If you've got a bass guitar track and you want it to have a chorusing effect, well, adding chorus is more of a coloring than it is cleaning, okay? So a good mindset is to start with cleaning, make sure all your tracks are proper. That involves, like when you get an x-ray at the dentist, we can use metering, like VU meters, to let us know, did we record something too loud? Does it need to be quieter? And then coloring is like, do you want your song to sound like it was recorded straight to tape? That is something that colors the mix. Do you want to add reverb? Do you want to sound like, if I sang something in this room, this is a very small room, if I add a reverb as if I'm in a cathedral, that's very much a color mindset. So cleaning and coloring. Now let's jump into Presonus Studio One. Now here on the screen, I have a really simple song. Now all the red tracks, these are my drum tracks. I have a kick track, snare drum, tom 1, tom 2, hi-hat, and ride cymbal. The blue track is bass, and then my yellow tracks are my acoustic guitars. Okay, we don't have any vocal in this. But the first thing is you go through and you make your production. So I'm assuming at this point, you've already got your recorded song, you've already got your production, you're just looking to start mixing. Well, this is where we need to start with cleaning our tracks. A lot of times you're so used to hearing polished and produced music, you're not hearing raw tracks. So all of these tracks have been recorded into my computer. I'm not using any compression, there's no EQ. Basically all my drums are going into the Sapphire Pro 40. It's a very clean preamp. Doesn't have any compression, any effects going on. And then a couple of these tracks, like the acoustic guitar and stuff, we're going straight to my RME Babyface Pro. Again, I'm not doing any EQ, no compression, no reverb. These are just the raw tracks. I'm going to pick somewhere near the middle of this song, and I just want you to hear what all these tracks sound like when they're just at full blast. So if I open up the mix tab, as you can see, we don't have any plugins loaded. All the faders are set to 0. Let's just take a listen to what's happening in this song. Now, in today's video, I'm using my in-ears. These are just single driver Shure in-ear headphones. I would not be wearing these if I were doing like a full mix, but for the sake of YouTube, it makes it a little easier on me trying to talk into the microphone at the same time. So how do I want to address this mix? What were the things that I was hearing? What I was hearing was everything is drastically loud, and it's okay for stuff to be loud, but what I mean loud is the bass guitar is blowing up my in-ears right now. It's too much of a good thing, so that needs to be addressed. Now I could go in here and I could grab the bass fader and I can just turn it down, and let's take a listen to what does that do to the mix. Now, if you're a purist, you can just go through and don't use any plugins on your mix. Just have all the faders moved to where they need to be. If the bass guitar is too loud, just turn the bass guitar down. That's not an unacceptable thing to do. It's just whatever style of music you're in and whatever would be appropriate. You may just be a person that just wants to move the faders. My personal recommendation when you're getting started is save all of your fader moves for last. I say that because when you start adding plugins and you're affecting the EQ, the compression, you start adding reverb and all this kind of stuff, your fader move is going to mean something different later on in the mix than earlier on. So we're going to save our fader moves for later. I'm going to go back up to these, like on the bass guitar, where it says -19.5. I'm just going to click. I'm going to type in 0, hit enter, bring it back to 0. Same thing from the snare drum, because I believe that there are other ways that I can correct this before I go to the faders right away. Now, the first thing I want to recommend to you is when you're going through the process of cleaning your tracks is that you make use of the solo button. Now, this might be controversial because a lot of people will say, don't use the solo button. It's all about the grand mix. But when you use the solo button, you're able to isolate each of the tracks and find out there might be a track that was just poorly recorded. You won't know where that sound's coming from unless you isolate each of the tracks individually. So now's the time to make use of the S key. The S key is on the keyboard, and any track you have selected, if you hit S, you can solo. Like here is the bass guitar soloed. I'll make a little loop region. Let's listen to the bass. How does that bass sound? It is pretty full and it's blowing up. So here are some cleaning things I would do to the bass guitar. The first thing is I need to find out how loud this bass was actually recorded, because not all tracks are going to be the same volume when you're recording unless you're checking your gain structure. So I've got the bass soloed, and I'm going to look down here at the meter and see what are we hitting right now. That bass track looks to be pretty healthy. We are in that -12 to -24 region. So the first thing I'm going to do on each of my tracks is I'm going to open up my plugins folder by going up to the insert. So if you don't see this window at all, make sure you have the mix tab open and then select one of your tracks, like the bass track, and go up to here where it says inserts, and you're going to hit this plus button. When you hit the plus button, this is where your plugin folders are located. If you're just starting out, if you just have like Presonus Prime, Presonus Artist Edition, if you don't have a lot of third-party or purchased plugins, look for the Presonus folder. In today's video, I'm just going to be focusing on Presonus plugins. So in the Presonus folder, the first thing I want to recommend you do is check out what's called Mix Tool. So when you click a plugin like Mix Tool, it's going to load on the screen. As you can see, now we have Mix Tool on our bass track. Plugins, if you're not aware, if this is brand new to you, plugins are a lot like how we use guitar effects pedals. So plugins come in all sorts of different shapes, sizes, and they do different things. You can have EQ plugins where we want to make something brighter, make something darker, and they all have different ways of doing this. Some plugins market themselves by saying, we make it brighter, but we also add a little bit of sizzle on top. They might add some harmonics. They may make it sound like a tape machine, like I was saying. The Mix Tool plugin is not a color plugin. Basically what this is doing is it's giving us a gain knob or a trim pot after we've recorded. So take a look at this. If I solo the bass track, I've got mix tool loaded. Listen to what happens to the bass and watch what happens to the metering as I move the gain knob around on this plugin. So the first plugin I'm going for when we're trying to clean up these tracks is always going to be the Mix Tool plugin. Mix Tool plugin allows us to make some corrections that might have resulted from mistakes when we were recording, or if you weren't recording the track, use this Mix Tool plugin. Now, why wouldn't you just go up to the track and start messing with clip gain? The reason you wouldn't mess with the clip gain is because it becomes hidden in the track. Now we've got this blown up bass guitar track, and we don't know really what happened to it. On the Mix Tool plugin, if I don't like what I did with the Mix Tool plugin, I can click this little power button indicator next to it, and now the plugin's bypassed. Now it's as if it's not there. With clip gain, it's a lot more difficult to get clip gain to reset back to 0, especially when you have a lot smaller audio files, like a bunch of little clipped samples all over the place. It's just gonna be a pain trying to get back to 0. So I use the Mix Tool plugin because I can just remove the plugin, click this little arrow right here. If you don't like it, just remove it. You can start fresh again. Clip gain is something where it's just a little more difficult to get it back to where it was supposed to be. It's not about having the finished mix right away, but these subtle moves are gonna add up over time. On the Mix Tool plugin, on the bass track, I have negative 3.36 decibels. That's not gonna make or break the song, but I'm looking at the metering because at this point, I'm just using my eyes. I'm gonna do the same thing for all of the tracks. What you can do is take this Mix Tool plugin, and if I click and drag and I drop this over on the ride track, for instance, it is gonna duplicate that plugin and all of its settings to the next track over. That can be useful, but I'm not sure I want the ride channel to be negative 3 point whatever decibels. I need to set it independently, but for now, I'm just gonna highlight this Mix Tool. I'm gonna add a Mix Tool plugin to all of my tracks. Now I've got Mix Tool loaded on all of my tracks. I'm gonna go through as it's playing, and I'm gonna make fine adjustments to each of the tracks so that no matter if it's the hi-hat or the snare drum or the kick drum, I need them to stay within that negative 12 to negative 24, because again, I'm not coloring, I'm just cleaning at this point. Now I've gone through each of the tracks. I've adjusted the Mix Tool plugin so that they're all more at an equal volume. Let's take a listen to all the tracks together and see if it sounds even just a little bit better than what we heard originally. The most egregious track was the snare drum, and that's going to be pretty common. When we hit the snare drum's very loud. So the snare drum was turned down by negative 7.92 decibels. If you click over on the tom track, it was down negative 3 for the floor tom. The hi-hat cymbal was only down like 0.72. The ride cymbal, I need to find a section of the song where I'm actually hitting the ride cymbal so that I can more accurately hear, because the ride cymbal mic is also picking up the hi-hat. So let's go to a ride cymbal section and take a listen. Okay, so in this song, I'm using what's called a crash ride. There's not a lot of ride cymbal being hit, and I am hearing a lot of the hi-hat in the ride cymbal. Should I make the ride cymbal as loud as the hi-hat is? Well, only when I'm hitting the ride cymbal do I want to gauge how loud the ride cymbal mic is. So if you're not hitting the snare drum, don't turn up the snare drum mic when it hears the kick drum, because then when you go hit the snare drum, it's going to be way too loud. The next plugin I want to talk about is the gate plugin from Presonus Studio One. This should come with the artist version. The Prime version, I believe, has gate as well. A noise gate is going to mute the track whenever that instrument's not being hit or moved. A lot of times we're using these on drums. So I'm going to put this on the kick drum. The kick drum mic that I'm using can sometimes pick up the snare drum. It can hear the cymbals, and I don't want it to get all that bleed, is what they call it. So I'm using the gate plugin to mute my kick drum for me. So that sounds pretty good to me. Whenever using gate plugins, it's very important you check out the release, because if your kick drum sounds like it's too clicky, it doesn't have enough body, turn up the release knob. The threshold, I'm using the threshold so I can make sure that the noise gate opens whenever my kick drum is being hit. If my threshold is too high, it's going to make me hit the kick drum harder for it to open up the gate. So there's more on that on my channel. You can check out the gate plugin later. The tracks I'm going to use the gate plugin for, mainly drum tracks, but not all of my drum tracks, because to me, the hi-hat and the ride, the overhead mics or the underhead mics, these cymbal tracks give me a lot of ambience to the drums, and it can sound really unnatural if all of your drums have the gate plugin. So the gate plugin, I'm mainly going to focus on the kick drum and maybe the snare track. I'll add the gate as well. You can add these to acoustic guitars. On vocal, it's especially going to be useful to use a gate plugin. Let's add it to the snare and see what it can do. Now with the snare drum track, I loaded a preset called SD1, and I'm mainly messing with the threshold because I want to make sure all those grace notes that I'm hitting on the snare drum, I want to make sure that those don't get lost in the mix. We're still in the cleaning phase, so we've added the mix tool plugin, which is kind of like a trim or a gain pot. We've added a gate plugin. The gate plugin is going to mute the tracks for us when we want them to be muted. So our next plugin for cleaning is going to be the Pro EQ from Presonus Studio One. Click the plus button, navigate to your Presonus folder. Whether you're using Artist, Prime, or Professional, they should come with what's called Pro EQ. You can use EQ in a colorful way, and you can also use it in a cleaning way. Okay, this first instance of EQ, we're using it to remove things that sound bad. Just like you'd be removing plaque from teeth, we're using the EQ to sculpt out frequencies that are just maybe too much of a good thing, or removing things like the sound of the air conditioning, which you might hear in this video as well. We have some ambience and things that may not be necessary for our mix. So let me show you on the bass track how I'm going to go about finding frequencies. I'm going to sweep the bands. So if I solo the bass track here, just hit the S key. As it's playing, I'm going to keep talking here, but I'm going to grab each of these little dots and I'm going to sweep the frequencies and find just ones that sound really, really bad. When I find them, I'm going to then cut the frequency. Hey, that one sounds really, really bad. This is the painful part. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do with this bass track. So this yellow one was pretty egregious. The Q that's on these EQs, the Q is basically how wide or how broad the sweep is, and then how narrow it is. So the lower the frequency, I wanna encourage you to have a more narrow band to it. And then the higher you go up, maybe use a wider Q, because as the frequencies go up, they're more trebly. That's kind of more like air and stuff. The more egregious ones, you don't want to lose all of your low end on the bass guitar, but some of these low end frequencies, as you heard, let's do a before and after. So if I remove this plugin, this is before. Here's after. Now, it's not perfect, but I definitely think it's better than what we originally started. So with this EQ plugin on the bass, let's take a listen to the whole mix now and just hear what it did. Again, because these faders are at 0. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna add an instance of Pro EQ across all of my tracks, and I'm just gonna look around for, are there some frequencies that I wanna go ahead and cut so that later on in the mix, they don't end up being so much of a problem. All right, so as you can see, some of these acoustic guitars, I use what's called a low cut or a high pass filter. I'm just rolling off all this low end because on acoustic guitar, I don't need my acoustic guitar to sound like a kick drum. Whenever you're mixing, whenever you're adding plugins, it's all about mixing it together so it makes a good recipe, okay? Sugar is good, but if you put too much sugar in your cake, it won't be edible. So try to eliminate the desire that you have to boost things that you really like. If you're a drummer and you're the drummer in your band that's doing the mix of your song, try to remember that as a drummer, you're gonna wanna hear more drums. So if you can remove some of those biases that you think that, okay, this snare drum sounds a lot better if I add a bunch of 100 Hertz to it, that might be something where you're trying to make your snare drum do what a kick drum's supposed to be doing. And then your bass guitar player is left kind of wondering like, where's all the low end? Sounds like it went to the snare drum. So try to eliminate and be objective as possible. So that's corrective. We're still cleaning. We've added EQ. The last bit of correction or cleaning that we're going to do on these tracks is with compression. Now with compression, It's really just something you need to use as much as possible so you get used to the sound of what it actually does. A compressor is going to make loud things quieter. It's going to make quiet things a little bit louder. Now, again, all of these plugins from Presonus have their own presets built in. So especially with compression, you may want to stick to some presets and then just tweak them to your liking. So here with this kick drum, the thing you want to notice whenever you load a preset, you're going to have to mess with the threshold. Bring that threshold down until you start seeing something being affected on the meter. There's a yellow meter here that when I play the kick drum, as you can see on the metering, we're getting like -3. It shows us how much gain reduction is happening. So -3, when it comes to this kind of corrective compression, we want to stay around -3, maybe -6 at the most. We don't want to do too much compression because it's not about, at this point, it's not about changing the tone of the instrument. We're just trying to correct for something that's way too loud. So if you have something that's just blasting loud and then gets really, really quiet, you might need to use more compression. Now, the built-in compressor with Presonus Studio One, just like with Pro Tools, these built-in compressors can sound transparent, if I can use that word. But I use this a lot, even though I've got other compressor plugins, because this isn't about giving it a color just yet. It's not about giving it vibe. It's more surgical. So I'm okay with using a stock compressor and getting about 3 decibels of gain reduction. Now let's go through and add some compression to some more tracks. So as far as cleaning up our mix goes, those are 4 plugins that you can check out right away with Presonus Studio One. You have the Mix Tool plugin. We're adjusting the gain if something's too loud, too quiet. We have the noise gate, where it's basically muting a track for us, like in between kick drum hits or in between snare drum hits as well. You can use the gate plugin on vocals. It's very helpful. The EQ plugin, we're using this instance of EQ to cut out frequencies that are giving us problems and try to make more room in our mix. And then we have compression. So compression at this point, it's just giving us a little bit of tucking in so that stuff is not too dynamic. If you recorded something where it's really, really loud, gets really, really quiet, we're just trying to rein in some of that dynamic motion. So now we're at more of a fun part because we're getting into color. Like I said earlier on, color is about adding vibe. It's really going to make this sound less like just a directly recorded song and make it have its own space and its own vibe. So this is where we have fun with effects. Up until this point, we've been listening to a mono mix. I've been doing this on purpose because especially when you're making decisions about frequencies of what's harsh, what's going to be in the way, don't use too much panning and don't use too much fader movement just yet. But if you want to pan things out, for instance, we have these 3 acoustic guitars. Let's take a listen to them together. Okay, sounds great. Let's spread them out so they all have their own space. This one's called acoustic high. Let's take a listen to that. To pan things out, you have at the bottom here where this blue vertical line is, I can either click and move this thing around. We'll take a listen to that. I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna type in L50. Then I'm gonna go to what's called acoustic low and I'm gonna type R50. So now I've got an acoustic guitar on my left, I got an acoustic guitar on my right, and I've got one in the middle, and the one in the middle is doing the strumming. So let's take a listen to those 3 together. So already in the mix, if I go through, like my ride cymbal is on my right, I like doing drummer's perspective. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna send my ride cymbal to the right 50, my hi-hat's gonna go left 50, my floor tom, I'm gonna go right 50, my rack tom, left 50. So let's take a listen to all the tracks together. Now we've done the correctiveness, we've cleaned up our tracks, and now we've panned them out. Let's take a listen. Nice. Now we're going to do some fader moves. So now that the tracks are cleaned up, we need to balance out the sound. So my kick drum, I'm rarely going to move this anywhere because I want to emphasize the things that you're going to keep at 0 are things you really, really, really want to emphasize. If this song had vocals in it, I would keep vocals at 0, and then I would take kick drum and snare drum and move them down about -3 or so. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna click here just above the fader because this is a little bit more precise. I'm gonna type in -3 and hit enter. Snare drum, let's go -3. Toms, I'm gonna keep these at 0 because the way that I'd use toms, since I'm not riding on the toms, I'm only using them in fills, and I want fills to be explosive. So I'm okay with the toms being louder than even what the vocals would normally be. Hi-hat and ride cymbal get decimated. So on these, it's really okay to turn these down way more than the others. Let's start off at -12 on the faders for the hi-hat and ride cymbal. I really want these two to work together because though I didn't record them stereo, I want them very much to act like stereo. Bass guitar, I'm going to go to about -6. Acoustic guitars, starting out, let's do the same thing. Try to use increments of 3. So -3, -6, -9, -12. You'll find a lot more use out of getting jumps of -3. If you're moving something by -1 decibel, people have ears for it, but it's not as perceivable to me. So I found it's just better that if you're going to turn down your hi-hat track, try to use increments of 3 because you'll spend all day long doing 0.5 moves here or there. Take a listen now to all these fader moves have been done. And this is literally just from experience of me using this drum set, being in this room. Take a listen to how moving the faders makes the mix sound a whole lot better because now we have some sort of, we're going for a vibe. We're going for more of a balanced mix. Specifically, I want you to hear how the toms, when I hit the toms, they really come out at you because we have the toms being loud during the fills, and we've got kick, snare, bass, and acoustics down there. Let's take a listen. The last thing I want to do is I want to address this hi-hat. Now, it may not be I'm hearing a lot of the hi-hat mic because the snare drum mic is actually picking up a lot of hi-hat. So if you're somebody like me that's hitting really hard on the hi-hat, it may be difficult to address this situation easily. But with the hi-hat cymbal, let's take it down to -15. And let's take the ride cymbal as well down to 15. And let's take a listen. Sounds good to me. So now we're at the stage of color. And the first thing I want to show you is how to add buses. So a bus is basically going to filter all of these tracks are going to get bused to their own specific groups. We're basically grouping these tracks and sending them out together in a bus. So if I hold shift and I select from the kick track all the way to the ride, if I right click, it'll give me an option for add bus for selected channels. This bus is now you can see the output of all these tracks is going to a bus. I'm going to call this bus. I'm going to click down here. I'm going to retitle it drums. And then from my drums bus, I want to go to another bus and I'm going to call this mix bus. Okay. So now I'm going to go to the bass guitar track. The bass guitar track, I can go down here where it says main. I click, it gives me an option. Do you want to send the bass to the drums bus or do you want to send the bass to the mix bus? I want to send the bass to the mix bus. And then the acoustic guitars, I'm going to highlight those, right click and say add bus. This bus I'm going to call guitars. And I can click and drag this over here so it's in nice order. And from my guitars bus, I want to go to the mix bus. Why am I creating buses? Well, what's really cool is instead of the individual tracks being edited, I can actually edit all of my drums together with their own unique set of plugins by using a bus. So if I solo the drums bus, what do you think I'm going to hear? It's just the drums. If I solo the guitars bus, now I'm going to do something. I'm going to go to the bass track just for you to be able to see it on the screen. I'm going to add a bus for just this one bass track. Not something I would normally do, but just so you can visually see on the screen, I've got drums, bass, and guitars, and then they're all being shifted into the mix bus. So what do I want to do with the drums? On the drums bus, I'm going to add a compressor plugin. Now, why would I add a compressor to my drums bus? Well, here's where we have color. Here's where we have vibe. You can do so much with the drums bus by giving it really just an over-the-top compression. Got a preset loaded called drums bus hard. I've got the threshold pulled down all the way. That means everything in the drums is being affected. If I hit play, you're going to hear an overly compressed drum set, but that's not where we're stopping. So this trick is normally known as parallel compression, but with Studio One, you have these mix knobs, and the mix knobs, what they allow you to do, as I pull back the mix knob, you'll hear less of the processed drums, but it'll be mixed in with the uncompressed drums, giving us a thicker sound. So let me play that, take a listen. So our first instance of adding color is adding a compressor to our drums bus and using what's called a parallel technique. I'm heavily compressing the drums and then I'm just giving a 50-50 chance. So half of what you're hearing is a really overly compressed drum set. The other half is uncompressed. What comes out is just a little bit thicker sounding. The other way we can add effects is by effects channels. So on the drums bus, if I go down here where it says sends and I hit the plus button, I can add an effects channel. The effects channel that I want to show you here today, under the Presonus folder, you have what's called room reverb, and it does exactly what it sounds like. We're going to add reverb to this drum set. So instead of it being recorded in this bedroom, I want it to sound like it was recorded in a stadium. You can really push this thing to the limits. There is a preset. We can scroll through here and let's go with things like cathedrals, churches, concert halls. Those are going to be pretty large. Let's go with the concert hall. And here under the drums bus, now we have this blue bar, which is a fader telling us how much of the drums bus is going to this effects channel. I'm gonna rename this effects channel. I'm gonna call it hall. So I know that's a hall reverb and I wanna send it to our mix bus. So the output of our hall is not going back to the drums, it's going to the mix bus. Let's take a listen now. We still got the drums soloed. Let's take a listen as it goes into this hall reverb. So a lot of times when I'm using a reverb plugin like this, like a hall reverb, I'm just trying to add some ambience to it. So I'm making it sound like it was recorded in a hall, but I have control over it, because if you do record in a cave, it's gonna be really difficult. All your microphones are gonna have that sound of the cave glued to the track. So when you use plugins like this, you're faking the sound of a big hall and you have a lot more control over how much of that hall you're hearing. So try to be subtle with it, so that you know it's there, because when you mute it, it feels like something got sucked out of the recording. Cool thing you can also do is on the guitars track, for instance, I can go up to sends and now I've got an option for hall. So I can actually send my guitars to that same reverb track. To me, this is a better way of mixing because I'm not having to add a reverb plugin on all of my tracks. I'm just sending my tracks to the hall reverb setting. So as you can see under the guitars bus, I've clicked the plus button, gives me an option now to send to the hall reverb. So I can use the same reverb plugin for my drums and my guitars, and then using this blue bar, I can adjust how much of the guitars are being sent to the reverb. Let's take a listen. Now, of course, you can go nuts with this and you don't have to add just reverb, right? So if I right click here and I say add FX channel, I can add something that's very unnatural. Presonus has one called analog delay. So this is a fun one that you can use. I want to send this analog delay straight to the mix bus. But let's go over here to the individual track. Let's say I want to send my snare drum track to this analog delay. Under sends, I can click the plus button. I can go to FX1. I need to rename that so it says delay. So now my snare drum and my snare drum only is going to this delay plugin. So let's take a listen to the snare drum. To remove it, you can just hit the down arrow and go to remove. But maybe on this acoustic guitar part, I want to send it to the delay. Let's take a listen. That one sounds really bad. So you have to be careful when using these pitch shifting delays. It's just a fun one. So what I want to show you is we are at the coloring stage. And when it comes to coloring, this is all about adding some vibe. There is going to be a setting on these delays where if you want to mess with it, if you want it to do some pitch shifting, if you want it to sound very unnatural, if you have a singer who's by themselves and you want that singer to sound like there's a choir behind them, you can achieve these kinds of things with reverb, with delay, with chorusing, all sorts of fun stuff. But it doesn't end there. Not quite yet. If you go over to the mix bus, this is, of course, if I solo the mix bus, what you're going to hear is the entire song. Now what we can do is on the mix bus, we can actually add our own EQ plugin. So here we have an EQ, and if I hit play, we've actually EQ'd the entire song at this point. And this is where you can have fun on the mix bus. A lot of times you're adding a lot of treble, you're adding some weight, you're adding some bass. It's not exactly unnatural, but this is where you can have fun by adding some color. Of course, if you've got a tape simulator, you can add stuff to your mix bus plugin. It's going to affect everything together. And a lot of times the compression is going to be gluing all of your tracks so that they sound more cohesive. Because at this point, we're not wanting to hear individual tracks. We're wanting to hear how they all come out together. So that has been an exhaustive rundown of the two things I want you to take away from this video are clean and color. When you're going into mix, try to put yourself in the mode of what do I need to clean? And then after that, what do I need to color? How can I add some vibe to this track? So many more plugins that we didn't get into. So I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. We'll be jumping into them in future videos, a lot shorter than this one. So if you haven't seen some of my videos on Studio One, check them out on the channel. I want to thank you so much for watching up to this point, and I'll see you next time.